Welcome to this week's edition of Flashback Friday, your opportunity to get some good review by listening to episodes from the past that Jason has handpicked to help you today in the present and propel you into the future. Enjoy.
Speakers, publishers, consultants, coaches, and info marketers unite. The Speaking of Wealth Show is your roadmap to success and significance. Learn the latest tools, technologies, and tactics to get more bookings, sell more products, and attract more clients. If you're looking to increase your direct response sales, create a big-time personal brand, and become the go-to guru, the Speaking of Wealth Show is for you. Here's your host, Jason Hartman.
Hey, it's my pleasure to welcome Corey Coates. He's the founder of Podfly Productions. He's got some good insights into tips and trends and best practices for podcasters. Just want to hear from him about that. Corey, welcome. How you doing?
I'm great, Jason. Thanks for having me.
Good. My pleasure. And you're coming to us today from beautiful Costa Rican paradise. Is that correct?
I'm not actually in Costa Rica at the moment. I'm in southern Illinois. I'm in the United States, actually scoping out some future locations for our Podfly offices in the U.S.
Good. Well, I'm going to ask you about that in a few minutes and about your business and the business model too. But, you deal with a lot of podcasters, obviously, in your business, and you just have a lot of firsthand experience and knowledge as to what's working and what's not working. I know that you made a great recommendation. Well, you've made several great recommendations for me that I can use in my podcasting business. And one of them was a really cool website theme. And I just can't wait to get that built out by our web development team and make that happen. And, you just have a lot of good best practice ideas. So tell us what you're seeing out there, any best practices, any trends, whatever you want to share. I'll just let you have it free form.
Sure. I've been podcasting personally since about 2006. I was running an independent music podcast when this medium really came to fruition. And I've really enjoyed watching and working with a lot of some of the industry leaders in podcasting over the last, I suppose, 8-9 years, and watching this industry evolve. And a lot of the folks coming from, I think, the terrestrial radio world now into the podcasting world is really what's making the biggest difference. People are finding what's most effective, how to really engage and reach listeners. But more importantly, Jason, it's getting to a point now that I think podcasting is gaining a level of credibility. It's becoming a household word. And that level of credibility means that there's also a level of professionalism that is helping people deliver a message in a different and more intimate way to a broader range of individuals who most specifically are tuning in a lot of these niche markets. I'm sure you're familiar with the concept of the long tail.
Oh, yeah. Chris Anderson, I'm a huge fan of his work, and he's got 3 great books, but the long tail is one of them, yeah.
Right, and when we look at, for example, the Amazon book model and how book sales have completely been upended as a result of targeting these niche markets, the same thing is happening now with audio content as well. Now we can find those 10,000 individuals who are extremely interested in what we have to say on a very specific topic, as opposed to trying to fight for that shelf space, if you will, and get in front of 1 million people and hope that 10,000 people are going to relate to it. And then, of course, the gatekeeper is now taken out of the equation as well. So we have the power in our hands to independently broadcast our message and directly market to and engage our listeners.
Right, we do. And the long tail is such a critical element because when you look at the now soon-to-be old school of talk radio, I was a big talk radio listener for many, many years, and it's just so random. I mean, the topics aren't necessarily related to what I want to hear, what I'm looking for, and you've got so many commercials. I mean, it's just, you only get 38 to 42 minutes per 60-minute hour of actual content. So podcasting, it's just a better medium. It's really narrow casting to a much more engaged and enthusiastic audience.
No, absolutely. And I mean, look, I come from the terrestrial radio world. I've done some commercial production for a bunch of AM and FM stations in the past back in Toronto, Canada, and that surrounding area. And I know the market, and I understand it quite well. And I understand the model very well. And it had been successful for about a century. But the reality is now, trying to constrict content to a show clock, squeezing in as much as commercial time as possible, And then, what's worse, trying to broadcast it from this sort of soapbox to anybody who might happen by it on the dial is just an ineffective way of targeting listeners.
It really is. And the other thing about it is, there's the concept of the shock jock, right? We've all heard of shock jocks. And when you look at AM talk radio, that's really, I don't blame them. That's what they need to be to get the listeners, because you've got to catch people as they're just channel surfing. Whereas podcast consumers are much more deliberate. So it's a much better model, no question about it. And I think when it really gets widespread adoption into the dashboard of the automobile, it is going to be huge. We're at the beginning of the podcast revolution, if you ask me. We're in like...
No, there's no question. You mentioned, getting into the dashboards. I was speaking to some of the folks over at Stitcher Radio, and these guys are one of the biggest up and comers. iTunes is obviously the Goliath in the industry still today as a podcast aggregator, but Stitcher is really making waves in how they're delivering this content and how they're marketing their product. Moreover, they just recently, closed a deal with the Ford Motor Company where Stitcher is now going to be a component, Stitcher Radio that is, in these Ford cars. So people will be able to get in, log into their Stitcher account and have all their favorite podcasts right there in the car, just as they would a radio station. So it's that accessibility to general public. I think that is the next step we need to get over. My mother understands that I have podcasts, and she understands that I do this.
She doesn't know how to get to one, though.
Yeah, but she's not going to go into iTunes and subscribe and sync it with her phone. She still goes to my website and hits the play button, so she imagines that I have an internet radio show. So really the next hurdle for us to get over technologically is like what Stitcher Radio is doing, and that's kind of making it accessible in an appliance sense, less than a technology sense.
Right. That's a good distinction. The appliance sense, the radio, it's just an appliance, right? Rather than, I've got to go into this app and I've got to find it and do all this kind of stuff. One of the things that I also thought that, would be kind of interesting, and we both know Carrie Lutz, right? And so Carrie, who has the Financial Survival Network, and I've been on that show many times, he really believes, and I don't know if he's right or not, but he really believes that people don't want to think too much about it. They just want it to be streaming. And I don't know kind of how we reconcile that with the concept of the long tail and people finding what they want. Is it that, or is it just let them turn the button on and content is playing? I'm not sure.
I understand, and I was working most recently with a company called Overseas Radio Network, and they had really a dual prong approach. That being, there was always a streaming station of their content, so people could tune in and just have this sort of passive experience, this ambient radio going of all of this content, but they could always drill down to specific shows and subscribe and listen to on their own time in their own way. So we're seeing a lot more podcast networks are going in this direction, having a stream going full time people can listen to and just, catch everything and anything that's coming through that production house. And if they find something they really like, they can go ahead and just grab that particular show and make it that mainstay in their phone or on their computer or what have you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, very interesting. Okay, so what are some of the best things podcasters can do now? If say someone listening is already podcasting, they're certainly a podcast consumer because they're listening. But say they're already podcasting, and they're doing some stuff, they're gaining an audience, they've got some traction. How can they really optimize more, and what should they be planning for in the future? I think they should plan for a bigger audience, number one, and we've talked about that. But just any best practices.
There's a combination of things. Number one is patience. Growing a podcast audience takes time. Even the best marketed podcasts out there will still take time to get into the ears of the listeners that you're trying to reach. Podcasting is still best marketed organically. The majority of the podcasts that I even personally listen to, and I listen to dozens of them every week, are ones that are recommended to me by friends. Very, very rarely do I go out and seek particular content in a podcast because it's just such an enormous sea. So that requires patience on part of the podcaster to wait for, if you're giving out good content, to get it out there. There's folks in the industry who say there's an 80-20 rule. You should spend 80% of your time marketing your podcast and 20% of your time producing your podcast. I'm of the camp that is, an inverse relationship. It really should be 80% of your time should be focused on creating great content and 20% on marketing that content, because great content is king. That is what the message will be for people ultimately. That's what people will talk about, and that's what will win the time of the podcaster. There seems to be within the industry today, as it's growing, and folks thinking that I need to somehow get myself into the highest rankings of all of these directories, ergo I will be popular. But the reality is, and I want to make a specific example if I could. I was just speaking to my girlfriend recently, and to see how many podcasts she has on her phone today. And it's only ever 4 or 5 that she regularly subscribes to. And, one of them, of course, is always Radiolab. Another one is This is American Life. She's listening a lot to You're Not So Smart. But the other 2 is a yoga podcast and I think a Buddhist podcast. And it's really until, for example, that yoga podcast starts to suck enough that she doesn't want to listen to it anymore, that she's going to go to a directory and seek it out. But even in this case, and this is actually statistically proven because there's some really good studies that recently came out in this medium that demonstrated when people are seeking out content, they very rarely go to a directory to find what they're looking for. They're going to poll people on Facebook. They're going to find their Twitter friends and say, hey, I'm looking for a good new yoga podcast. Does anyone have any good recommendations? Mm-hmm. So I think for a lot of the podcasters, when they're thinking about those best practices, is to consider who your audience is and that you're fighting for their time. So going back to my original example is that she only has 4 to 5 hours a week that she's going to afford to even listen to podcasts in the first place. So what you're not really doing is you're not fighting the top 20 yoga podcasts out there. You're fighting for that 45 minutes a week that listener has to give to you. And that requires patience.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it definitely does. And, what is your thought? I kind of thought that's what you were going to say, is you were going to address the idea of audience size and not being totally hypnotized by that. You kind of came at that from an angle. So, I mean, that's a point maybe I want to get across, and I think you're going to agree with me, is that it's really about the engagement of your listeners and, how that you don't have to have a giant audience. That's really the broadcast mentality a lot of podcasters have adopted, right? We're KFI, we're the #1 AM radio station, 50,000 watts, blah, blah, blah. But you don't need that. There's a good old quote that I've always liked, Corey, and it's, goes something like this. I'm probably going to butcher it, but it says, one person with a commitment is better than 1,000 people who are just interested, and I think that's the thing with our listeners.
100%
right?
agree. And, I try and put these things into real terms for a lot of the folks that I work with. And that is, if you only have 500 people a week downloading your show, a lot of people kind of think that's such a low number. Maybe this isn't worth doing. But here's the reality, Jason. If you put it in real terms, in physical terms, if you got 500 people every week to get into a room and listen to you for 45 minutes, you're kicking butt. You're doing something right.
Of course. You're like on your way to becoming Tony Robbins,
That's right. So a lot of folks who are thinking, I need 10,000, daily subscribers to my show and I need to put all of this content out. We get hypnotized into this idea that, I better put out 3 to 5 shows a week so my numbers are big. But this mentality is one that is antiquated in how we might approach an advertising firm. Mm-hmm. If we're looking to monetize our podcast, we can say, here's our demographic. We have 50,000 regular subscribers, and I want to sell some ad space on my podcast. But that's not the point of podcasting. That's the point of radio. Mm-hmm. So we have to remember this is a completely different medium, and that a small audience size is actually a dedicated and intimate audience size. And that's the point, and that's what we're really shooting for.
I can hardly wait to the day when we can tell how many people are actually listening, not just downloading. It's always downloads rather than actual listens. Well,
it's the same thing. I mean, it comes from the web world as well. People want to know, how many uniques does your site get? And I really don't know if it matters or if I care if I'm not selling banner ads or affiliate links. The reality is how many people are reading my content or interested in what I have to say. And more importantly now, because it's not the radio format, we're on that soapbox and we're broadcasting information and hoping people are interested in it. It's now an engagement, and it's finding a way to create an intimacy with our listener and making us more relatable to them. And that's the whole purpose of podcasting, is we are literally in the ear of a listener. And we're able to create that relationship. We start building trust, we start building credibility, and we start building a level of engagement that we couldn't do with a more one-way conversation as with the past.
Okay, so, there's a lot of technology out there, and it's really easy to be distracted by it. And, we get this sort of flavor of the month or, in today's world, flavor of the hour concept where, I got to, download this new app or join this new social network or, do this. Just give us a couple of tools that you see podcasters using successfully.
From the consumption end or the creation end?
Probably the creation end or the distribution end.
Sure. I'm actually on a microphone right now. I'm on this Apogee 96K mic.
Yeah, the one I'm on too. You told me to buy it.
It's a great little microphone, and it's compact. It's got a little lightning cable that plugs into an iPhone or an iPad. Mm-hmm. It sounds phenomenal, and it's ultra portable. So we're finding like the technology itself now is getting much more compact, a lot more compatible with everything, and a lot easier to use. So nowadays, it's as easy as just having GarageBand on your iPhone, plugging in this microphone, getting on the road, and you can go ahead and do your show. So it's no longer that you need a mixing desk and multiple microphones and 2 days of consultations to get everything set up. Any individual with an iPad or a laptop can just plug in and go. So we're finding that the technology is becoming more compact, a lot more affordable, and the professional quality is a lot higher. So there's an example right there. I'm using a particular mic that 10 years ago would have been a joke in broadcasting, but is completely acceptable, and I know is being used even by professional voiceover artists.
Yeah.
I think that's number one, and I know a lot of people are starting to move away from some of the big dogs in podcasting and looking at maybe taking control over their feed. There's some great services out there, but there's some up-and-comers as well. I've been talking to the folks over at a company called Buzzsprout, who have as many, if not more, clients than, the Goliath Libsyn these days. And these up-and-comers are looking at podcasting from a completely different approach. Is how to make it easier and more user-friendly on the front end so that anybody can get their message out there. It's almost like 2-3 years behind blogging and web platforms where, as you knew 10 years ago, to have a sophisticated website with good content and well-maintained required at least a web developer, a designer, a whole lot of people. But nowadays, we can log into something like Squarespace or Wix and slap together a website that is absolutely gorgeous, super professional, and it's hands-off.
Right.
So where podcasting, I think, is going is where web development was a couple of years ago. We're really starting to get our footing in the technology and make it a lot more accessible to the general public, because there's still a barrier to entry for really interesting individuals who have incredible messages to deliver. It's just the technology is still a little too intimidating for them, but we're starting to see that rapidly change.
That's getting a lot easier. So tell us about Buzzsprout and like what's their different take? Libsyn is huge. Most podcasters know about Libsyn if they don't use it already. But what's the concept of Buzzsprout?
Buzzsprout is going to have a similar approach, and it sounds like, I understand they have upwards of 10,000 shows right now that they're hosting, which is to me absolutely incredible. But what they're looking at is doing more integration on the front end and production side of things. We're seeing things like companies like Auphonic that are doing web-based audio processing, leveling things out, smoothing things, compressing them, making them sound better. Things that were usually the domain of an audio editor are becoming more accessible. And again, if you want to think in terms of something like photo editing, it's almost the same idea. Photoshop is this enormous bloated program that's terribly intimidating, and it takes you 6 months to get good at it. Whereas now...
And I've never learned it. I only wish I knew how to use it.
I just don't think I'm going to live long enough to even bother, to tell you the truth.
Yeah.
But we now...
If I could use Photoshop and Audacity and Final Cut Pro, I would feel like a genius.
Oh, you're telling
and make
me.
My own WordPress sites. I would love that.
But we're seeing now a lot of these types of services are becoming web-based. Even the great photo filters and editing is available on everything from Instagram to your Google Plus to everything else. So it's finding a way of making this accessible. And when I was speaking to the good folks over at Buzzsprout, this is the direction that they're really looking at taking it, because they're not thinking about how to compete with services that are out there today. They're really looking at what they can do to advance the medium in the next 3 to 4 to 5 years. Mm-hmm. And doing that really means we've got to get in front of the podcast. There's still an issue with a combination of, we find in our industry, two things. Number one, the pre-production, the physical equipment and the use of that equipment is still not up to par. It could be a lot more professional and people need a lot more help. And the second thing, Jason, and this is a little off topic, but at the end of the day, if you're not really a particularly interesting individual, it's really absurd to think that you're going to have an interesting podcast. And that's really what it boils down to for a lot of folks. They're not successful in podcasting largely because they're not generally talented. And they really don't have anything interesting to say. If you're not a good conversationalist, what makes you think people would want to listen to you have a conversation? If you're not a particularly good speaker, why would you want to speak to somebody for 45 minutes and expect them to care what you're saying? So I think it's a combination of those two things. It's still, content is king. If you're not talented and it's not well produced, it's not going to do well.
Yeah, right. Yeah, very, very good points. Very good points. One of the things I've been having this very small debate with my friend and coach, AJ Amex. He's been on the show before. I said to him, I made a prediction. I said, one day I think everybody will have a podcast. And he thinks I'm nuts for saying that, right? But here's what I mean by it. I don't mean that everyone will have a podcast in the way we think of it today. But since a podcast, Corey, is really just nothing more than an audio blog or a video blog, and there are video podcasts, although it's the less popular medium. And look at how, people all have a Facebook page nowadays. I mean, not everybody, of course, but 1.5 billion people or whatever the latest number is from Facebook, right? And so I think that's pretty much going to become true with podcasting. Everyone is going to have a video or an audio feed as part of just their social profiles. And of course, you can stick this stuff on Facebook now. We all know that. But it's going to work its way in sort of a different format to where when you just want to know about it, what your buddy is up to, you're just going to you be able to go and listen to their latest audio message, and it's going to be a way for people to communicate asynchronously from one to many. Now, we communicate asynchronously now through email, text, voice messages on voicemail machines and so forth, and with voice messaging through apps and such, and now the new iPhone has it through text, which is fantastic. But this will be the one-to-many format. It's not like they'll necessarily have a big audience. Maybe the average Facebook user has 150 friends, for example. It'll be like that, where you want to, hey, what's up with Jason? Let's just listen to his latest message.
I would agree.
Right?
A lot of people are looking for a hub. They're looking for a directory. And here's the good thing still about broadcast media is that, despite the fact that there's a gatekeeper between you and your audience, it's still pruned. It's still produced. Things don't get on television, don't get on radio unless they're good. There has to be quality. And the social component that's possible with what you're speaking of is that it would be socially pruned. Those things that are liked, those things that are shared, those things that are commented on, those are the things that will, populate and bubble up to the surface. So I can absolutely see your vision of that there's still a hub, a place, a Facebook of podcasting, if you will, that people would go to, but still only the best content would be visible unless you're actually drilling down and looking for it. Because at the end of the day, people still need that content to be massaged and handled and given to them in a professional package to make it consumable. It's really, with YouTube is a great example. You can scream into YouTube all day, and if it's terrible what you're saying and it's poorly produced, you're going to have 3 viewers, and one of them was you. Whereas if you're doing something that is interesting and compelling and well produced, people are going to like it. People are going to share it. People are going to see it, and it's just going to naturally, bubble up to the surface.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, makes complete sense. Well, tell us a little bit about what you do at Podfly.
Podfly Productions is a podcast production company, and really what we're doing is we're making it easy for people to have their own podcast. We're working with a lot of people who are either hobbyists, entrepreneurs, business people who want to add another layer to their message. They usually have a professional website and a blog and a newsletter, and podcasting is the latest thing. It's something that they want to do to engage their clientele and customers directly and add a little bit of credibility to what they're doing with the industry. It's a quick way to raise your authority level, if you will, by having conversations with people who are also authorities in particular fields. So what we're really doing is we're providing the pre- and post-production services so that individuals can focus fully on their content, booking their guests, and producing great shows. We'll worry about all the dirty work. We'll do all of the editing, get your intro together, make you sound professional, get you into the hosting site, get you posted up on the web, put you into iTunes. All of the little nitty-gritty things that need to be done to have a podcast and maintain it, that people simply don't have either the savvy or the time to do.
Yeah, no question about it. And I tell you, Corey, you have been bugging me for a couple of years to come over and take advantage of the Podfly services, and I did that just recently. And I got to tell you, I love it. You're doing a great job. It's really so much easier to unfragment, if you will, all these little different components of the business, from, getting an image on the WordPress site to editing the podcast to doing the transcription. And what we're doing now is a nice best practice that I've been recommending for a while. And I originally kind of copied the idea from Tucker Max, the infamous Tucker Max. and he's got a podcast, and he's got a well done professional website, as you would expect. I mean, he's a big celebrity. I call these enhanced show notes. And so what you're doing is your team will edit my podcast, transcribe my podcast for all of the podcasts in the Hartman Media Network. What have we got, like 20 shows? Well, if you take out the video, we don't have that many. But with video podcasts, in doing all of that, it just all goes up at once, where it used to be I had to wait for the transcriptionist after the show was published, and, I had to deal with a graphic designer and say, hey, let's get a better image up there. And, it was just this really discombobulated thing, and it's become a lot more streamlined. So we're getting a lot more content out to the audience, which I really like, because I think one of the things you want to do, as long as you have good content, is you want to offer a lot of content. Because in doing that, if the audience likes you, fill up their time with your content. Why not? If you don't, somebody else will. And so this has just really allowed us to get a lot more content out there. So I appreciate it.
Well, it's funny you mentioned best practices as well, because one of the biggest recommendations for a lot of our clientele is we sign our clients on monthly packages, and that really encourages them to have consistent release schedules. This is key. If you don't release a podcast for 2 or 3 weeks, it is not unreasonable to think that you're going to lose your audience, and much of it. And you have to rebuild it for a number of reasons. Number one, the podcast aggregator, such as iTunes, is going to automatically stop downloading because it sees you've stopped listening. And two, if I don't get my dose of my favorite show on Tuesday for 2 weeks in a row, we're creatures of habit, and we move on and get to a point that it's like, I'm not going to go seek out this content any further. So you're right. Having a lot of medium available on a very consistent basis is what builds an audience, plain and simple.
Yeah, no question about it. And, so many of my listeners over the years have told me, if you would just publish on a regular date, like literally, and they've said this to me, I would be waiting. If it was every Wednesday, I would be waiting for your new episode every Wednesday. And, we've been doing this for a long time, 7 years now. And so we have not always been very consistent. So I think you're right. And I've noticed already the ratings are coming back a bit as we've been more consistent and we're publishing more content. So I couldn't agree more. That's a good thing. Do you want to, before you go, Corey, and I know you've got to run, address anything about, when you look at iTunes, being in the new and noteworthy section, or in the what's hot section, or anything like that? How to do that? How to, we made the disclaimer about rankings, but let's go back to rankings.
Sure. And look, at the end of the day, if you are in the top 20 in iTunes, you've got it made. You're golden, because you're so much more discoverable. Especially have we seen recently, like iOS just updated to iOS 8. They made podcasts, a native application on the iPhone. This is in front of my mom now, like it's never been. And she's only going to see those top 20s. She's going to go, what are podcasts? And then she's going to flip through them and look for a category. And she's going to subscribe to the ones that are in the top 20. So there's a lot of buzz in the industry, again, about how to get up into that ranking. And there really is no way of gaming the system, okay? The Apple formula is really straightforward. It's based on the number of downloads over a 4-week period, okay? And then from there, it's also the number of subscribers. It has absolutely nothing to do with, and I have evidence of this, it has nothing to do with your ratings. It has everything to do with how many downloads over a period of time and how many people subscribe to the podcast. That's what makes something new and noteworthy. If you have a consistent, then download rate and growth rate and subscriber rate, you're going to stay up in that top 20, plain and simple.
Yeah. Good stuff. Good stuff. All right. Well, give out your website and tell people where they can find out more.
People can head to podfly.net and find out about me and our services. And you can get onto our Twitter account, our Facebook, and engage us directly that way.
Good stuff. Corey, thanks so much for joining us today.
Always a pleasure.
Copyright the Hartman Media Company. For publication rights and interviews, please email media@jasonhartman.com. This show offers very general information. Opinions of guests are their own. Nothing contained herein should be considered personalized, personal, financial, investment, legal, or tax advice. Every investor's strategy and goals are unique. You should consult with a licensed real estate broker or agent or other licensed investment, tax, and/or legal advisor before relying on any information contained herein. Information is not guaranteed. Please call 714-820-4200 and visit www.jasonhartman.com for additional disclaimers, disclosures, and questions.